It's difficult to fool your brain, and
That's fascinating.
a calorie is not necessarily a calorie.
Professor Torsten Bohn is a leading food scientist and nutritionist. For more than 10 years, he has been serving as the editor-in-chief of the International Journal for Vitamin and Nutrition Research. Like no one else, he knows how important healthy food is for our body and our brain. Today, he will answer the trickiest questions.
That is one of the big risk factors for developing Alzheimer's, Parkinson's.
So the brain is fighting with you.
That's an interesting question.
Professor Bohn, nice to see you.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Could you tell us what, from your opinion, is the most fascinating secret of the brain?
Well, the brain is a many splendid thing, right? I mean, just the amount of information that it digests, even on an unconscious level. I mean, all the things that you do from breathing, sleeping, waking up, that you don't never think about it. But of course, the brain is also very crucial in order to make cognitive process, to think in science, of course. I mean, we live with and then by the brain, we develop new ideas and fascinating things can come out of that. From a nutritional point of view, I'm always baffled by the amount of information that the brain digests and how difficult it is to kind of bypass it. I mean, the brain has a very strong kind of set point for the energy that's coming in. It's related to the hormones that are secreted in the gut and everything. And it's very hard to kind of overcome your trigger to go for food, to get calories, even curbing down calories by 20%. The brain has a very strong set point for memorizing what comes in. And this relation between the brain and the periphery, the hormonal items in the digestive tract, that's just fascinating. So
the brain is fighting with you, right? So
I'm not sure whether I would call it fighting, but it's an interaction. And the brain has a very strong sensor, I mean, that has sensors, of course, all over the body, and it communicates with your gut, and the gut tells you what energy is coming in, what amount of nutrients are coming in. There's ghrelin, there's leptin, there's insulin, and everything else that it communicates with. And many of these signals end up in the hypothalamus, in the arcuate nucleus, in some neural network, and they really interact and also give you a set point for satiety and the amount of food that you may crave.
Great. You're a specialist, of course, for healthy food, healthy eating. Could you tell us what impact does it have on our cognitive function?
There are many things to consider. On one hand, our brain needs sugar or ketone bodies to function. So without that, we cannot think. I mean, if you are very low in insulin, for example, and you don't get the sugar into your cells, your brain will starve. You get even into coma. So the regulation here of the brain is super crucial. And to have enough sugar, to have a very well-balanced diet, for good insulin feedback to be within the normal delimiters. But this is, of course, short-term. There are many long-term aspects as well to be considered. So a healthy, balanced diet really helps us to stay cognitive, to stay flexible. It's important for hydration. If we are not well hydrated, now it's also very warm weather outside. If you don't drink enough water and then fluids that don't dehydrate us, then also we will suffer. There will be problems in our blood flow. And for example, if you have troubles with your weight, or even if you're having obesity, then you have a much higher risk of suffering from cognitive ailments or even neurodegenerative diseases that can even double your risk for that. If you have a very poor diet and end up having obesity, that is one of the big risk factors for developing Alzheimer's, Parkinson, and many of these chronic diseases related to cognition.
Wow. But if we speak about healthy food, I don't think there is another topic that has so many misconceptions around that as healthy food. You're, of course, an expert in that. Could you tell us what is actually healthy food, healthy eating?
Yeah, that's rather many splintered thing here, I would say, because it's very many individual aspects that are to be considered. Nothing so much has changed in some of the general recommendations, that your diet should be balanced, you should have different things, not always the same. You should eat not too sweet, not too salty, not too many simple fats. You should have your 5 a day, that is your fruits and vegetables, 5 times 80 grams of fruits and vegetables, that is per day.
5 times?
5 times is the rule, at least, according to most nutrition associations, being it the World Health Organization or the European Food Safety Authority or the more local ones like the German nutrition associations. And of course, this is very important also to give us enough macro and micronutrients. So you should have enough dietary fiber. It's also important for the gut microbiota. Maybe we come back to this a bit later. It's important for your digestion. Of course, you need proteins, carbohydrates. But if you have too much sugar, too much salt, and even trans fat acids and too many saturated fatty acids, then possibly you are more at risk of developing more chronic diseases related to inflammation or oxidative stress, and that would be detrimental in the end.
I wonder about this topic of sugar, so you hear so often that people should reduce sugar. You just mentioned that it's really important for our brain. So is it sugar, white sugar that we eat and put in our coffee, or it's different kind of sugar? So how do we know
The simple sugars, you should have less than 10% in your diet regarding energy intake. So the recommendation is clear to avoid simple and added sugars. So this includes household sugars, this includes sugars as we often drink it in sweetened beverages, so no sodas. The sugars should come from complex carbohydrates. So there's this glycemic index. The sugar that goes...
What is that?
This is an index that gives an idea how quickly the amount of carbohydrates and sugars that you consume end up as sugar in your bloodstream. And the slower, in general, the better, because this prevents the insulin roller coaster. If you eat a lot of sugar, your insulin level goes quickly up, but it quickly goes down again after the sugar meal, and then you get hungry again. So the satiety effect is also very low. So a balanced glycemic index, maybe around 50, maybe more with pasta or maybe more with fruits and vegetables and whole meal grains, they result in a slow increase in sugars that will give you more constant energy and again avoids this roller coaster of the hormones. So these sugars are needed.
So the good sugars, they are sugars that are contained in vegetables, in fruit, in... I don't know.
Yes, indeed. The sugars are often the same. I mean, it's fructose or glucose. Of course, it can also be starch. It is then broken down during digestion and then the sugar is taken up. It is a bit more how you combine it. So if you have things that are rich in dietary fiber, in whole meal grains, in fruits and vegetables, then the amount of sugar is not that easily taken up. It rests longer in the stomach. It is passed much slower onto the small intestine, and even some of the dietary fiber, they kind of complex a bit with the sugars. They link a little bit up with your enzymes to make them slower in the digestion, and it is just a much slower reaction to the sugars. And that is considered much more healthier than the sugar boost that you can get from energy drinks or from table sugar or even from white bread or white rice.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I just would like to switch to another topic. You read often that processed food is very unhealthy food. So how can one distinguish between unprocessed food, processed food, and highly processed?
The processed foods are often packed. If you look at the ingredients list that is on the packaged food, you get a good idea because the ingredient list is often very long. There are often a lot of additives. It can be stabilizers, it can be emulsifiers, it can be colorants, etc. And this is an indication that the food is processed or ultra-processed. There are classifications like the NOVA classification. If you are grade 4, then you have ultra-processed foods. And of course, this gives you a kind of general indication, maybe how unhealthy foods are, but it can also be misleading. For example, you can have maybe a wholemeal grain bread that maybe is processed because it was obviously heated, maybe it's ground to some degree, maybe it has some stabilizer, maybe it has some ascorbic acid or something else added for the taste, some citric acid, and that would already count as ultra-processed. But this is much more healthier than, for example, a soda, a Sprite, or something that is rich in sugar and has no complex composition in carbohydrates and dietary fiber. So it's an indication, but by itself, from a nutritional point of view, we are careful to kind of stigmatize it only based on the criteria of processing. Because again, there are so many different products out there and they can be healthy but ultra-processed foods, but there can also be less processed foods, pure sugar, that is in the end, unfortunately, not so healthy.
You just mentioned food labels.
Mm-hmm.
And can we really trust the labels that we see in the supermarket?
By law, there are certain limits. So, for example, there can be certain tolerances. So, for the macronutrients, there can be 10 or maybe even 20% less or more than what is stipulated on the label. For some of the micronutrients, for minerals, for certain vitamins, the tolerances are even bigger, like 50%, like half.
So it's not that...
So it's not that precise science. And in addition, what's also very interesting, only certain aspects need to be labeled by law. So all the real goodies, as we say, many of the micronutrients or even the secondary plant components, the polyphenols, the carotenoids and other phytochemicals, they don't appear anywhere on the label. So if you just look on the label and you compare, for example, the classic case is the Coca-Cola versus the orange juice, then it looks like the orange juice is less healthy than the Coca-Cola, right? Because it's even higher in sugar than Coca-Cola, the normal one at least. But on the other hand, you list not all the micronutrients and all the secondary plant components. If you would compare this, of course the orange juice would fare better, but by law, that's not needed to be on the label. And that's a crux for other labeling scenarios. Think of these front of the pack labels like the Nutri-Score that we have in 7 European countries. I'm a member here as well in the scientific committee, so I'm always a bit concerned also about these additional labels. And the Nutri-Score can only work with what is by law on the food label. So we cannot consider all the micronutrients and secondary plant compounds. And that's a limitation, but as we often say, the perfect should not be the enemy of the good here. It's better than nothing, but of course it can never be perfect.
But what would be your advice if someone goes into the supermarket? How he or she should orient themselves?
Well, you can get some basic ideas from these front of the pack labels. Here in Luxembourg, like in France and some neighboring countries in Germany, we have the Nutri-Score. So you can get a basic idea that A and B is in tendency from
better,
a healthier nutritional profile and better for your health than maybe D and E. So there are certain criteria for that. But you still have to vary a lot. I mean, as I said, you should go for maybe whole grain products. You can, of course, make a list and go with the one that is maybe a bit shorter in the ingredient list, and maybe you end up a bit less often in these ultra-processed food items. And you should, of course, have some fresh items as well. Maybe non-packed items, fruits and vegetables, to prepare them at home, to take your time for it, and not get everything pre-packed or fast food-wise from supermarkets and fast food restaurants.
And to the other question, there is this idea that nowadays we try to grow our food not the way that it used to be. Mm-hmm. And this brings us to the fact that probably our vegetables and fruit don't have enough nutrients in that. And now we come to this idea that probably we all need to eat food supplements because we don't have enough minerals in the food. What do you think? Should we all take food supplements?
Yeah, you hear this quite a few times, I would say, especially from the supplement industry. If you follow a normal, healthy, balanced diet, you don't need supplements. There are very few exceptions. Maybe they're worthwhile to list them. So this is women that want to become pregnant, and then you need to take folic acid. In our areas, we also are very low in iodine, so you should maybe choose fortified salt in order to get your iodine, because the ground here, where the soil where we grow our vegetables and grains in is very low in iodine and selenium, for example. And if you're vegan or maybe vegetarian, you should look into your vitamin B12. But these are the only exceptions. If you otherwise focus on a balanced diet, you should be able to get all the macro and micronutrients, so the essential nutrients that you need. But it is true, because of the very intensified agriculture that we have established, maybe not so much the organic food, but the traditional food, the conventional methods. That is true. If you look in the last decades, levels of magnesium, calcium, iron, even some vitamins like vitamin C, they have been decreasing. Some say 20, some say even up to 50%. It depends, but we should not forget that there's a huge variability in all the foods that we consume, depending on where they have been grown, which is the soil, what is the climate condition, what is the processing, how do you store it, how do you process it in the kitchen. All this has a huge impact. So in addition to that somewhat existing variability and maybe decline over the decades, we have this huge inter-individual differences depending on where our food comes from. So if you follow, nevertheless, a balanced diet, you are able to cover all your micronutrients needs. The problem may, of course, be also that many people that don't follow a balanced diet, and indeed then you could argue maybe with a capsule of a micro mineral multivitamin capsule like A to Z and how they are labeled, it's kind of an insurance. Maybe you don't make too much wrong if you get one a day. You can benefit from it and you make sure that you avoid deficiencies, but you should possibly abstain from these very individual high-dose supplements because there are indications that people have taken, for example, beta-carotene that was thought to reduce oxidative stress because it's an antioxidant, has increased the chance of getting lung cancer, especially for smokers. And for some other micro minerals, like for selenium, there's a very low, like a therapeutic window, meaning you can easily overdose and maybe increase your risk of developing diabetes or other chronic diseases.
So it can have negative effects.
There's always an optimum, it's like this U or J-shaped curve. Of course, you need a little bit to cover your needs. Then there's an optimum. Within that, you are good. But if you take too much of a good thing can be negative as well. Then you do potential harm to your body. Too many antioxidants can have pro-oxidant mechanisms activated, and that can in the end lead to cancer, or in some other cases, you dilute your blood, thinning with too much vitamin E or multi-unsaturated fatty acids. You can increase your risk of bleeding, selenium and type 2 diabetes, as mentioned. Chromium can increase your risk of oxidative stress if you take too much. So you have to stay within the recommendations.
Wow. And what about calories? There are two opinions. One is that people should calculate calories, not to get obese. The other opinion is actually calories don't matter as long as you take healthy fats.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing as well. I would say normally it's not needed to count your calories. I mean, it's maybe of interest. You can look into it, especially if you never did it. I have done it in the past. My son is doing it out of fun. And it could be interesting to see what you consume. It's definitely, it can teach yourself maybe a little bit where you get the energy from. But in the end, I think if you look too much into it, it can become like too much of a fanatic thing. And then you circle too much always around the concept of calories and energy, and that's possibly not a good thing. It's maybe even demotivating, and psychologically it's a too narrow circle. And in the end, we also have to state that contrary to what you might think, a calorie is not necessarily a calorie. It depends where the calorie comes from. For example, if you consume your calories more in terms of protein, you lose in the end more of that caloric intake because of heat, because the metabolic turnover of proteins is that high that the body produces a lot of heat. It's good to stay warm in winter. It's good maybe if you don't want to accumulate too much body fat, then maybe a little bit more proteins could be maybe helpful. And also, maybe not all the energy that is in there is fully absorbed. So maybe some ends in your gut and might be good for your gut microbiota. They might also want some energy, such as some dietary fiber. So a lot of calories that are maybe measured in a calorimeter, and therefore, yes, they should be on the label, but they're not fully absorbed, or you combine it in a way that the calories are not fully absorbed. And some food items, even though maybe the caloric intake between carbohydrates and proteins maybe might be the same, you maybe get more hungry again if you consume a calorie in terms of sugar compared to proteins or lipids. So in the end, it will stimulate your appetite even more. And so it's not that simple really that a calorie is really a calorie.
Yeah. And another interesting idea that I often see on the internet, that healthy food is the food that is not tasty. Do you agree with that?
No, not necessarily. I think it can be very tasty if you have a lot of dietary fiber, if you have a lot of plant-based food items. It can be very spicy. It can be having a lot of herbs. You can eat a salad. You can ramp it up with some great spices, some garlic, some pepper. You can put some nice, even tasty oil and aceto balsamico onto it. There are a lot of things that you can do, and it doesn't have to be caloric, and it can definitely be very healthy. And on the other hand, of course, you can cook your things to death if you overheat them for a very long time, and then in the end they will lose the taste just because all the aromatic compounds are very heat and oxygen sensitive. So you better keep it a bit cooler and maybe think about how to preserve your aroma and flavor.
Do you have a favorite recipe?
I'm not a great chef, I have to confess. I often go with a nice salad and I dress it up. I make it a bit spicy, add some pepper. I like wild garlic, Bärlauch, we call it in Germany. And I add some aceto balsamico and some olive oil or some cold-pressed oil. And also this way, you don't only add flavor, you add a bit of fat that helps maybe to absorb all the micronutrients from the salad. And that can be great. And also with the warm weather, quite satisfying as well, I would say.
Yeah, sure. And, in different countries, we have different patterns. How do we eat food, or what do we eat? Is there any difference? I mean, which traditional kitchen is better for your health?
That's an interesting question. Indeed, there are some cultures. I mean, if you go to Asia, then people, for example, in Japan, have been there for a little while ago, and they have a lot of seafood, a lot of algae food, which you don't find that much on the market, a lot of soy products, and many of these are also rich in secondary plant compounds. Fish is rich, of course, in polyunsaturated fatty acids. You have these famous omega-3 fatty acids that can be even anti-inflammatory, that are also good against neuroprotection. And in general, I think there's also the, the mentality to have maybe regular rhythm, to have a lot of physical activity, to smoke less. All these things are, of course, also very important when it comes to cognition, and just have a healthy lifestyle that is balanced with a lot of dietary fibers, maybe a bit less processed. And I think many of these, especially these seafood products and the algae products, can be very healthy. Another example, if you go to South America, people consume a lot of potatoes, maybe less rice and less white rice. That is maybe not the very best choice if it comes to dietary fiber and richness and micronutrients. But if you go to potatoes or sweet potatoes also, they contain a lot of nutrients. Even there are some archipelagos in Japan, like the Okinawa Islands, where people have reached a very high age. There are a lot of these centenarians, so these are one of the blue zone areas, and they have consumed a lot of sweet potatoes instead of white rice. Oh. But maybe you don't have to go that far. If you follow a vegetarian diet, a bit less meat, Luxembourg has been champion in world consumption of meat 2012, including a lot of processed meat with
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It was, I think, around 137 kilo a year, so a lot, even though maybe a little bit went to the dog, or maybe was brought by foreigners across borders, but nevertheless, it was very high consumption. And a bit more plant-based diet, vegetarian, even if it's ovo-lacto vegetarian, if you eat eggs or drink milk and eat milk products, it can be making a difference, because it is more, has longer satiety, less sugars, less processed foods. It's also good for sustainability in the end and for food security worldwide. And overall goes along with a lower body weight. And as I said again, lower body weight and lower risk of developing obesity is also clearly linked to maybe up to reducing your risk of Alzheimer's and other cognitive or neurodegenerative diseases by half in the end.
But there are a lot of people who say, like my father had the same diet as me, my grandfather, they all were healthy. Why should I change my diet? What would you answer to that?
It's a fair question, and maybe your diet in the end is not that bad after all. Maybe you follow the recommendations, you have your 5 a day, you eat balanced, you don't eat only ultra-processed, you look a bit into your portion size, which is also a very important topic. You take your time for eating, it's also crucial. Maybe you socialize, so you gain maybe more pleasure out of it, what you're eating or when you're eating. But I think there's always still a bit room for some improvements. I mean, who of us is really always able to consume the 5 a day? What do we do if we face maybe a hunger attack? What do we choose? Maybe you can be prudent. Maybe you have an apple at hand. Maybe you eat some handful of nuts. And in the end, also, it's quite interesting to consider maybe when you eat. I mean, there's this adage, you are what you eat. But maybe thinking a bit chrononutrition, you might also be when you eat. That's a bit of paradigm change. But there is some truth to that. There's this famous saying, in the morning, eat like an emperor, at noon, like a king, and in the evening, like a beggar. And there are studies that show, indeed, if you eat too heavy, too much in the evening, even though maybe it's still reasonably healthy food, if it's too rich in carbohydrates, if it's too fat, your body will not be able to really process that. It will rather store it because of all the hormones that kind of shut down in the evening, and we all are circadian beings, and that is a limitation. So there are also these new studies coming up around intermittent fasting. So maybe we don't want to eat less calories, but a way to bypass it is maybe you eat a bit more in the morning, a bit less in the afternoon. You avoid something eating very late. And there are also indications that that could also be beneficial. So again, not only maybe what you eat, but maybe when you eat also plays a role.
Wow, that's fascinating. And you know, if someone really would like to change the way he or she eats, so changes are very complicated to make. Do you have any advice in that how a person can really change habits?
Yeah, it is indeed not that easy. And coming back to the question at the beginning, it's difficult to fool your brain and that, and you cannot just reduce even your energy intake by 10 or 20%. It's super difficult. But of course, you can make little things, little adjustments. So I would say rather than radical changes, go for small steps, put yourself reasonable, small, achievable aims. So steady stroke will fall great oak, and you can make sure you have your 5 a days. You can think of maybe what do I eat and snack in between, especially if I face a hunger attack. And maybe you can reward yourself, maybe not with food, but maybe put some money aside if you realize that you have reached maybe a certain gain of getting your 5 a day for something you would like to invest in.
Gamification of
something like this, whatever can help you. But I think a big reward by itself, if you just feel better. I mean, maybe you have a target goal regarding weight, even though weight is not everything, and it's also difficult to change in short to mid-term. The body has a very strong set point, but maybe little things can help you, maybe combined with physical activity. Maybe you want to do the ING next year or even the half marathon or something like this, and the sportive times give you very good feedback, or the amount of running or stair climbing or walking that you can do and want to do can give you a good feedback by itself. And also, of course, last but not least, if you feel good, if you feel alert, if you feel awake, and there also a healthy diet can help. It's maybe not everything, but it's a good contribution to that.
Do you have a favorite hack? How do you hack your brain into doing something it doesn't want to do?
I guess there's no magic trigger for that. I think you have to be more careful, maybe not to fall in the typical traps that you get really super hungry, that you don't negatively think what to avoid. But what you can do is you can think of what you like. So maybe you have certain fruits, vegetables, or nuts, or certain recipes that are still reasonably healthy. And these you can put on your meal, on your daily meal planning. And this is much better than kind of thinking, I cannot have that chocolate, I cannot have that dessert, which is psychologically maybe not so rewarding and difficult to really overcome, but rather think of what you can do and what are the positive elements in your diet that you can put on your meal plan. And if you insert some of these, you will automatically eat some of the unhealthy food to a little bit lower degree.
So positive thinking is
Positive thinking is very important.
Great. Thank you so much for this interview.
You're welcome.
Thank you.